school.
How's everybody?
And nobody ever...
Good. All is well, thank God.
It just what? I mean, we just coexisted. It didn't matter if you were Catholic, Protestant or Jewish. We were all dressed the same in uniform.
Maybe you can give us a three-part series. It's very interesting. I'm serious. I mean,
It was a very charmed life. I grew up very fast because I left England and went to live in the Far East. Now that was a whole different story, but that's another story. And
That's another three-part series.
I came into contact with Sephardic Jews.
Well, so we're going to get there today.
All right.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the last and final round of the History of Destiny series. We left off last time, basically the goal is to cover 1,500 years today. So we'll see what we can do. And we have a video as well.
Wow.
We left off last time in Babylon. The Talmud was finished. That was the ultimate recording of the oral Torah. Now everything was captured, everything was safe, so to speak. The Torah in its most pure form was written down, and therefore the Jewish people were kind of ready to go out into the world. They had what they needed, so to speak. And we're about the year 500 CE, the closing of the Talmud, and they lived in Babylon for hundreds of years afterwards. And the truth is, out of all the places that we've ever lived throughout the entire world, and all of our journeys, outside of Israel, Babylon is really our second home. We were there right after the first temple period. Many people, we said, stayed there, never went back to Jerusalem for the second temple. So we were there in Babylon for hundreds and hundreds of years. Around the year 600 or so, there was a camel driver that walked in, a camel driver.
Thank you.
That walked into the historic scene. His name was Muhammad. And he claimed to be a prophet of God. And he liked the Jewish people, their perspective, the idea of one God, the idea of monotheism. He felt that the belief in Jesus as being God or being part of the Trinity was no good. And however, he changed many things. His goal was to get the Jews involved as well, and he thought they'd be more than welcoming, they'd be embracing of his new religion, because ultimately it was very similar in a sense. The Jewish response was, no thanks, we're okay, we've been doing good for the last 1,000 years, we'll stay with this. He wasn't too happy with that. And he himself, Muhammad, murdered many Jews, many of the Jewish leaders of Medina. He wrote many anti-Semitic comments in the Quran. He actually changed their Sabbath from Saturday to Friday. He changed Jerusalem as being the ultimate holy place to Mecca. When they prayed, they no longer faced Jerusalem, but they faced towards Mecca. And they even rewrote history. In the Torah, it speaks about the binding of Isaac, the test that Abraham was given to see if he would sacrifice his son Isaac. Comes along Muhammad and said, printing error, it was not Isaac, it was actually his other son, Ishmael. And it's an amazing thing, because a person who doesn't have the historical background might say, well listen, who's to say who's wrong or right? Maybe it really was Ishmael. But with the historical background, we realize the Torah was written a long time before Muhammad was ever born. And the idea to go ahead and change history is an amazing thing, but somehow they got away with it. And that was the basis of their religion. Many things very similar, many things very different. Now, it's interesting if you look back to the origins of Islam, or the origins of the Muslim approach in the Torah. They claim to be the children of Ishmael, the descendants of Ishmael. We know Abraham had two children, Isaac and Ishmael. Ishmael was with Hagar, and Isaac was with Sarah. In the Torah itself, it says very clearly, and I'll quote you, this is when God's informing Abraham that he's going to have a child with Sarah. So Abraham says to God, listen, I have Ishmael, I'm okay, I'm good to go. And God said, I quote, "Nevertheless, your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac, and I will fulfill my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. But regarding Ishmael, I have heard you," meaning I understand you want him to be successful as well. And he says, "I have blessed him. I will make him fruitful and will increase him most exceedingly." So God's telling Abraham, I'm not going to make him your spiritual descendant, so to speak. The covenant that we made will be through Isaac, but I'm going to give him blessing. That blessing is they're going to be very numerous. "But I will maintain my covenant through Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year." This is explicit in the Torah. Now, what's very fascinating is the growth of Ishmael. The amount of descendants that he has had throughout the centuries is mind-boggling. Right now, there are about 1.5 billion people in the world who consider themselves part of Islam. 1.5 billion. 23%. That means pretty much 1 in 4 human beings on planet Earth are part of Islam. So the idea of the Torah saying that I will increase your descendants, the descendants of Yishmael, we definitely see has come to fruition. I saw a statistic that in the year 2030, there's going to be, when the world's population will be about 8 billion, the estimated amount of people associated with Islam will be 26% of the world's population. So we definitely see the words of the Torah coming to fruition. God said he will not be the bearer of the covenant, but he will be a numerous, multiples people, and indeed we see that. We furthermore see somewhat of the character of Ishmael. The Torah says, describing who Ishmael would be to Abraham, God says, he shall be a pera adam. Pera adam means a wild man. This is going to be the nature of this person. His hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And over all his brothers shall he dwell. This is the prophecy that God is giving Abraham. This is going to be what Ishmael is. These will be his descendants. A wild type of human being. A human being, he'll be against everybody, and everybody will be against him. And it says furthermore, later on, God said, it said, and he grew up, referring to Ishmael, he dwelt in the desert. Got another glimpse of this type of person living in the desert, and became an archer. That's how he was defined. He was defined by his warfare, so to speak. So we have an amazing insight that when God is telling Abraham who Ishmael is going to be, and what type of people will be his descendants, we've seen this throughout history as we're going to explore tonight. The fulfillment of the prophecy of being a pera adam, of what's translated as a wild man, the idea of jihad, the idea of translated as either holy war or holy struggle, that itself is probably the best manifestation of what it means to be a wild human being. They were very successful, though, during the times of Muhammad. In 20 years, they were able to conquer the entire Middle East, from Iraq, Iran, in the east, Libya, North Africa in the west, Saudi Arabia, to Yemen in the south, Israel, Turkey in the north. 20 years, they were extremely successful based on these character traits of being natural warriors, so to speak. Desert warriors. What is the destiny of the people of Ishmael? What is the future of the Arabs? The future of the Muslim religion? We have a tradition that tells us that throughout Jewish history, there's supposed to be 4 exiles. 4 times when we'll have adversity. Number 1 is referring to the exile of Babylon. Number 2 is the exile of Persia. Number 3 is the exile of Greece, like we spoke about last week, the Hanukkah struggle. Number 4 is the exile of Edom, which is Rome. That's when the Romans came and destroyed the Second Temple. But there's also a 5th exile, and that's referred to as the exile of Ishmael. Now we believe that the descendants of Edom, the descendants of Rome, namely the German people, and we assume Hitler is the descendant of the Edom, of the Rome, which is ultimately the descendant of Esau. That's not the end, though. There's one last Golus, it's referred to as one last exile, which is going to be the main struggle between the Jewish people, and the main struggle in the world will not be against Edom, will not be against the Rome. Rome not meaning Rome itself. The Roman Empire, we know, after 500 no longer existed, but the descendants of Rome, namely the Christians. They were our arch enemy for centuries. They were the ones, as we'll see tonight, with the Crusades and the forced conversions and tremendous murder throughout every century. But they're not going to end there. The end is going to be somebody else, and they're going to be the descendants of Ishmael, meaning the Muslims. They're going to be the last hold, so to speak, before what we refer to as the times of Mashiach, before the time of clarity. Which is an amazing thing, because if you would have told somebody this 100 years ago, they would have laughed. The Arabs, the Muslims, they're just a bunch of people riding camels in the desert. What are they going to do to the world? If you would have told somebody this, I venture to say, 15 years ago, they probably would have laughed. After 9/11, if you would tell somebody this, they might start to believe you. After what's happening with Iran and Israel and the entire conflict, it's become very clear the tradition that we've had for over 1,000 years, that's the final struggle, is the struggle of good versus evil in a sense. The fanatic, the extreme Islam, with those ideas of trying to conquer and convert the whole world, or death, versus what we refer to as ultimately the goal of the Judeo-Christian philosophy. That's the destiny of Ishmael. We have, during the 8th century, a new form of Judaism arises, as it does every so often, like we've seen, the Karaites. And the Karaites are actually throwback. They're very similar to what the Sadducees believed during the times of the Second Temple. The Sadducees, we've said, they basically felt there was no real veracity, no real authenticity to the oral Torah. The only thing that's real is the written Torah. They didn't last too long, though. Ultimately, the true, authentic Judaism prevailed. But now we have, in the later part of the 700s, a new movement, the Karaites, who believe something very similar. Once again, we don't need the oral Torah. We don't need the Mishnah. We don't need the Talmud. All we have is the text itself, and that's sufficient. And it was based on that, and they did many very funny things. For their Shabbos, how did they celebrate Shabbos? It was in the cold and in the dark for 24 hours. Because the Torah says, Lo savaru eish b'chol moshvosechem b'yom Shabbos. Do not light a fire in any of your homes on the day of Shabbos. But the way they interpreted that verse was, you're not supposed to have fire at all on Shabbos. And therefore it's dark and it's cold. The way that we understand that verse, based on our tradition, based on the Mishnah, based on the Talmud, is that you're not allowed to light a fire on Shabbos. That's just one example of many. And therefore on Shabbos that they never had hot food. And it's because of that, it's actually a mitzvah, it's a good thing that for Jews around the world to make sure to have hot food on Shabbos, to be able to say, we don't believe in the Karaites, we embrace the oral Torah. That's where the custom of having cholent comes from. You have hot food on Shabbos to show, I believe in the oral Torah. But they were actually a very powerful sect of Jews, very influential for their time. But once again, like every other sect that diverges from authentic Torah Judaism, we see the same trend. It might last for a couple years, even a couple hundred years, but it doesn't last forever. Now in the world, how many Karaites are there? A couple thousand people who happen to live in Israel who call themselves Karaites. But that's about it. And they're not Jewish. We have the very interesting story of the 4 captives. What exactly was the turning point when the Jews really left Babylon? In the 900s, there were 4 heads of yeshivas, 4 great Torah scholars, in a boat together, and they were going to raise money for the yeshivas. Pirates came along and they captured them. And what do you do when you capture people who you know are famous rabbis? You ransom them. You get as much money as possible. And that's what they did. They went to different communities throughout the known world. And like always, this is a part of the tradition of all Jews, based in the Torah itself. It's actually an obligation of the Torah. If you have a brother, your fellow Jew, who's in captivity, you got to get him out. So the Jewish people, wherever they went, they would ransom one of the rabbis. So one rabbi ended up in North Africa, one rabbi ended up more in around Spain. So you had 4 rabbis altogether that through this tragedy ultimately started yeshivas, Torah centers in those places, and that was part of the reason how Torah flourished really outside of Babylon. So here we have the Jewish people spreading out, the idea of opening Torah centers outside of Babylon, and then we have the Crusades. We get into the later part of the 1000s, the first crusade 1095 to 1099, where they captured Jerusalem from the hand of the Muslims. The goal was to kill all the infidels, referring to the Muslims. Their goal was to destroy the Muslims. Along the way, though, they felt if we get some Jews as well, why not? And many, many thousands of Jews were killed in the Crusades. There are many crusades. And along the way, we'll see, as the Jews spread out throughout the world, different countries we find ourselves in, there's always a period of peace and tranquility, just like we spoke about earlier on in regards to Egypt. It started off very well there as well. But usually what happens is something goes strange and wrong and doesn't end up good. And that's what happened. In England in 1290, that was the first time that we got expelled from any country. What was the date of that?
9th of Av.
The 9th of Av. Here we have the 4th time in history. The truth is, we had the spies, we had the first temple being destroyed on the 9th of Av, we had the second temple being destroyed on the 9th of Av, we had Bar Kokhba rebellion being destroyed on the 9th of Av. I'm not sure I mentioned that last time. Here we have in 1290, the Jews being expelled from England on the 9th of Av. They were expelled from France in 1306 and 1394. They were expelled from Hungary in 1349 and 1360. They were expelled from Germany in 1348 and 1498. They were expelled from Austria in 1421. They were expelled from Lithuania in 1445 and 1495. They were expelled from Spain.
That's a big one.
And that's a big one, 1492. Why is that a big one? Because Spain was the major home of many, many Jews for hundreds of years. That was the golden age of Spain. And we had some of our greatest rabbis there, greatest commentators who lived there. Jews were very influential in the society. They had leadership positions. They were in government. 1492, after about 100 years of a very rocky relationship, they were expelled. Once again, the date of that was the 9th of Av. So we're noticing a trend. This is probably not a coincidence. We have Portugal being expelled in 1497. And the question everybody in the world asks is, why the Jews? Are we that bad? Why do you hate us so much? Now, it really depends who you ask. If you ask the people in Spain in the 13 and 1400s, why do you guys hate the Jews so much? Well, most likely the response would be, because they control everything. They're too powerful. They're too wealthy. They're too influential. They run Hollywood. That would have been the response of people in Spain. You go to different places in the world, we weren't always wealthy and powerful. Many places in the world, we were poor and we were viewed as inferior. And you'll ask people, so why do you hate the Jews? They'll say, because they're filthy, they're gross, they're dirty, they bring down society. And the truth is, you go around to every country, you get a different answer. So what does that mean? What's the real answer? Clearly, if everyone's giving a different approach, a different excuse as to why we don't like the Jewish people, that means it's probably not the real underlying answer. What is the real answer?
Killed Christ.
We killed Christ. That's debatable, historically speaking. But it's hard to say that that's the ultimate reason why the anti-Semitism was not limited to those who were very religious Christians. We find it in the Muslim world as well. The truth is, in the beginning of the Muslim force, when they really became powerful, they were actually very kind to the Jews. we related a lot more to the Muslims than to the Christians. For centuries, the Muslims, they weren't our friends. They didn't treat us as equals. In the Quran, it's very clear that you're allowed to steal and kill anybody who is not of your same religion. But there wasn't necessarily a constant persecution. We were able to live together. In contrast, many generations, many centuries with the Christians. But there's hatred all throughout the world, and it's been this way forever, and it continues this way. And I think the only real answer there is something that's beyond the surface. You can't tell me because we're too rich, or we're too poor, or we're too much in control, or we're too much inferior. There's got to be something deeper. And I think it goes back to what we've said before, what we're going to see in regards to the Holocaust. There's a subconscious understanding that somehow the Jewish people represent God in the world. And there's something that threatens me about that. You're the conscious, we almost view as the source of morality, and that's frightening, that's overwhelming, and sometimes, quite frankly, I guess I would say, you might feel threatened. That's a good word. But I think it comes from a subconscious understanding of the reality of what it means to be Jewish. It happens to be, I feel, one of the greatest miracles throughout history. The greatest miracle throughout history is the fact that there's such a hatred for the Jews. So many different people, so many different places, so many different excuses as to why. That itself is miraculous. The Black Death, 25 million people were basically died in Europe. That was half of Europe's population. Who was the source of the Black Death? The Jews. They were poisoning the water and the air. The blood libels we find, the Jews are taking Christian babies and they're using their blood for matzahs. When there's hatred, there's tremendous imagination. You could think of all sorts of amazing stories, and that's what happened. But throughout all of these centuries, and through the good and through the bad, through tranquility and through times of tremendous persecution, there were always great people. And I think that's the history of the Jewish people. We could go on for hours and hours and hours about all the names and all the places, like we said we weren't going to do in the very first class. The real history of the Jewish people is the leaders. The Jewish leaders, I don't mean leaders in the political sense or the national sense, but the Torah leaders. When you read what they wrote, what did the Rambam write? The Mishnah Torah. What was Rashi's contribution to Torah scholarship? That's the real history of the Jewish people, because that ultimately changed the Jewish people, perhaps more than anything else, was the Torah scholarship. And we find great people. We find Rashi, of Shlomo Yitzchaki, who was born in 1040, died in 1105, lived in France. He himself is probably referred to as the greatest of all commentators. He has a commentary on the Torah and all of the Bible, all Tanakh. He has a commentary on all of the Talmud. He is essential for anybody who tries to study anything in the Torah realm. You need Rashi. Rashi himself didn't have any sons. He had two illustrious daughters, Yocheved and Miriam. A lot of stories about their piety and their righteousness. Rashi himself taught his daughters Talmud. They wore tefillin, something that women don't do, but Rashi felt they were on that level that for them it was appropriate.
Yes.
Although he didn't have any sons, he had very pious, very scholarly son-in-laws, very famous. We have them in the Talmud as well. He had grandsons. We have the Rambam, Maimonides. We could spend the whole time speaking about his life. Maimonides was born in 1135 and died in 1204 in Cordova, Spain. That's where he was born. Maimonides is the way of referring to the Rambam, which stands for Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. Moshe, the son of Maimon, as his father's name. His father was a judge in Cordova, Spain, and they were forced to leave when the Rambam was 13 years old, based on Ummahad persecution. Ummahad was a fanatic sect of Muslims going throughout Spain, basically saying, convert or die. And the choice that Maimon made, his father, was, let's get out of here. I don't want to die, don't want to convert, so we're going to leave. And they journeyed throughout Spain for about 10 years until eventually they came to Morocco. They settled in Fez. They were there for 5 years. Once again, Olmachad persecution. They had to leave Morocco. From there they went to Israel. And tradition has it that Maimon, the Rambam's father, died in Israel. But from there, also things weren't secure. They went to Egypt, and that's where the Rambam lived the majority of his days. He became the head physician of the Sultan of Egypt. That was the Rambam. And his contribution to the Torah scholarship was tremendous. What he did is, he went through the entire Talmud, and he came to the recognition that there's so much discussion here. There's so much back and forth, question and answer, proof and disproof. For the layman to read through all of this and to know what to do on the practical level. Okay, Rabbi, can I do it or can I not do it? It's impossible. So he took it upon himself to write the Mishnah Torah, which is a 14-volume work, where he lays out, based on the entire Talmud, this is what we do. Here's the practical, down-to-earth Jewish law. And it was extremely well accepted. He actually writes in his introduction that once you have this work, all you need is the Torah itself, the written Torah, the Tanakh, the Bible. But there's no need for the Mishnah or the Talmud anymore, because through my creation, I have here everything you have to know from the oral Torah. And you can imagine his contemporaries weren't so pleased with that line. And they argued and they basically felt, listen, you're a wonderful man, but there are different approaches out there, there are different perspectives. But the Rambam was one of the greats as well. He personally was very influential in destroying not through force, but through the force of his intellect, the Karaite community in Egypt. When he went there, the Karaite community was very influential, but through the power of his personality, by the time he died, it was definitely mitigated. We have Nachmanides, the Ramban, very similar, not to be confused. Rav Moshe ben Nachman, he was born in 1194, died in 1270. Also well known for his scholarship, not just in Spain where he lived, but throughout the entire world. There was a famous debate in 1263. Pablo Cristiani, who used to be Jewish, they're always the worst. People who convert, they're always the most intense. In both directions. If you're converting because you're sincere, many times you're more sincere than the Jews. If you're converting the opposite way, because I'm converting to Christianity, then I'm out to get the Jews. And that's what Pablo Cristiani was trying to do. He wanted to have a debate, and basically the king of Aragon, James I, went to the leader of the Jewish community, the Ramban, and said, we're summoning you to come to the debate. And the Ramban said, no thank you, I have no interest in debates. There wasn't much of a choice, and he was the man for the job. So he said, I have one request. You have to allow me to express myself. If we're going to play games here and I can't answer the questions, this is just going to be a total waste of both of our time. And surprisingly, King James responded, okay, I give you freedom of speech. They had a couple debates, and the Ramban destroyed Pablo Cristiani. He ran circles around him. It was embarrassing. And the comment that King James made to the Ramban afterwards is, I've never seen a man before defend a wrong cause as well as you have. I'm not convinced. Ultimately, no matter what you say, I'm Christian. But he was very impressed with the Ramban's response, with the Ramban's debate. He gave him 300 gold coins, but it didn't end so peacefully. You can imagine once you embarrass the church, once you make them look foolish, it's not going to be pleasant afterwards. And he had to flee. But he was hearing rumors. People were going out and saying, oh, Pablo Cristiani won the debate. Clear, the church was victorious. And he could not have that. So what he did in his brilliance, he sat down and he wrote word for word the debate. What did he say? What did I say? Back and forth. We have that manuscript nowadays in the writings of the Ramban, the Kisvei Ramban. We have the exact debate of what took place. Just so for future generations, no one should ever think for a second that they had the upper hand. He left Spain and he actually lived the rest of his life, the last 3 years of his life, in Israel. There's a synagogue there in Israel referred to as the Ramban synagogue, where he started a little bit of a shul. When he came to the land of Israel, it was pretty much desolate. Nobody was there. There were no Jews there. That's where he died. And it's interesting, that was the longing, that was the desire of so many of the greats, to one day have the opportunity to see the land of Israel. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, also one of the people in this time period, that was his dream, to just be able to see the land, the promised land that God promised Abraham centuries ago. And legend has it as well that he made it there right before he passed away. That was the dream of the Vilna Gaon in the 1700s. The great genius in Vilna, the leader of all of the Jewish people. He wanted to make it to Israel. He himself couldn't, but he sent many of his disciples to Israel, and it was really through his disciples they were the first people to really start settling the land. Way before the Zionist movement, it was the disciples of the Vilna Gaon in the 1800s who were there settling the land of Israel. So right now we find ourselves the period from about 1038 till 1440. That span of about 400 years is known as the time of the Rishonim. Rishonim literally means the first ones, the first of the commentators. And that's when we had Rashi and Rambam and the Ramban and the Rosh and the Tur and many of the great names that in the walls of the yeshiva, these names penetrate the heart and the mind because we learn them every day. Those are referred to as the Rishonim. In 1150 CE, taking a look at the Jewish people throughout the world, we have the Sephardim, people living in Spain and people living in the Middle East. 85% of the entire Jewish population, only 15% at that time, 1150, were Ashkenazim. Fast forward to the year 1650, and there already you have a little bit more of equality. 50% Ashkenazim living in Europe, Western, Eastern Europe, and then you have as well in Asia Minor, North Africa, about 50% of the Jewish population, Sephardim. Trying to move very quickly over here. In the second half of the 13th century, we have a man by the name of Rabbi Moses de Leon. And Rabbi Moses de Leon publishes for the first time a book called the Zohar. And the Zohar, like we mentioned last time, is the main source of Kabbalistic literature. Originated by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, we said, was one of the 5 main students of Rabbi Akiva, who really was one of the main parts of the tradition that we have, going back for the oral Torah. Shimon Bar Yochai, he himself wrote the Zohar, but it was never published, it was never for public consumption until Rabbi Moses de Leon came along and he published the Zohar. It wasn't so helpful though, because it was not organized, it wasn't at all in a fashion where you could read it and understand it. It was cryptic, it was kind of hard to make heads and tails out of it. And that's why later on, a couple hundred years later, a man by the name of Moshe Cordovero came along, and his goal was to make sense out of the Zohar. What the Rambam did for the Talmud, he took the entire Talmud and he made sense out of it, so to speak. He made it more concise and more organized. That's what Moshe Cordovero did for the Zohar. And he wrote a famous work, and he was known as one of the master Kabbalists. He lived in Sfat in the 1500s. After him was a man known as the Arizal, who took it even a step further, and now the Kabbalistic traditions that we have really come from the Arizal's understanding of Kabbalah. In the 1350 to 1650, those 300 years, right, the Renaissance period, life was changing, the world was changing, Europe is slowly coming out of the Dark Ages, and things are just different in the world. And there is more of a focus on culture, more of a focus on art and music, and ultimately more of a focus on the human being. Then the Enlightenment comes. In 1650 to 1850 we have the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, where the idea of faith is something that's looked down upon. The idea of doing anything that's not rational is viewed as something that's just grotesque. And we have during this period many people feeling, hey, who needs religion? We have science now. That'll answer all of our questions. And I think it's because of this influence, because of the Enlightenment, we have different movements arise within Judaism. This time, not trying to do things different, not like the Sadducees, not like the Karaites, but different movements within authentic Judaism trying to reinforce some of the basic ideas that perhaps were lost along the way. We have a man, Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, born in 1698, died in 1760, known as the Baal Shem Tov. Baal Shem Tov, we know many amazing stories about this person. He was the leader, he was the creator of a movement referred to as the Hasidic movement, which literally means the pious, the righteous movement. But his goal was, because he felt there was a weakening of faith, there was a weakening of people's connection to Judaism, there needs to be more joy. There needs to be something where the layman could connect to Torah in a deeper way. What was happening up until his point, he felt that those who were the scholars, those who were very accomplished in their learning, they were very connected to Torah. But there are many people who didn't have the luxury, didn't have the brain capacity to learn, and they had to work all day. And what was their relationship with Torah, with God? And that was his goal. He wanted to create something within authentic Torah Judaism that would inspire the masses. And ultimately, it was a tremendous success. The movement of Hasidus spread throughout Europe like wildfire. Many, many people joined the movement, different flavors along the way. But that was the Baal Shem Tov. A little bit later came along a man named Moses Mendelssohn. And we mentioned him before briefly. Moses Mendelssohn, living in Germany in the later part of the 1700s, he was also bothered by the Enlightenment. He was bothered by the fact that he noticed this lack of connection the Jewish people were having, but he took a very different approach. His approach was, if you can't beat them, join them. We'll cut off this, we won't do this as much, we'll be Germans, all will be well. Needless to say, like every other movement throughout the centuries, a little bit, the deviation doesn't work too well. But it was based on his ideas, the Reform movement emerged. And the Reform movement, really in the 1800s in Germany, started off extremely radical. The Reform movement today is not nearly as radical as it was originally. They, at their first inaugural dinner, made sure to serve pork at the dinner for the Reform movement. It was an entirely different, I don't want to say religion because they were Jewish, but it had nothing to do with Judaism. They were trying to somehow maintain Jewish culture, Jewish nationalism, but it wasn't Judaism in the classic sense at all. They renamed the synagogue the temple because they wanted to show that we no longer have a desire for the temple in Jerusalem. We don't need that. We're living in Germany now. It's our homeland. This is our temple. We're fine with this. They were also the ones to create the name Orthodox Jews. To say a Jewish Orthodox has a connotation of they're very stringent, they're very to the right. Until that point of time, there was no title Orthodox Jew. It was very simple. What did it mean to be Jewish? I follow the Torah. I do what the Talmud tells me to do. I live a Jewish life. But at that point in time, that normative Jewish life suddenly became extreme. That's what Orthodox was. Somebody asked me a couple years ago, there are two types of questions. Sometimes a question is a question, where someone's sincere and they really want to know the answer. And many times a question is an answer. I don't really want to know what you have to say. I'm just telling you my opinion, and I'm stating it in a question form. This was the latter. Somebody was saying, I don't understand. Why are you Orthodox? Why do you do this form of Judaism? So I said back to him, very simple. I'm just doing what every other Jew did for the last 1800 years. Why are you doing what you're doing? The question is not over here. The question is on anything else that's new and innovative. If you don't want to do what the Torah says, that's fine. But don't question why I'm keeping what the Jewish people have been doing for centuries. But that was the creation of the Reform movement, was to be able to put in perspective those who were really the normal mainstream up until that point. They were now viewed on some level as the extreme.
What parts of of Judaism was the original reform movement holding on to? Like what
We don't have time to get into all the details. There's a lot of interesting, and different people had different ideas. It wasn't just like one philosophy. But just to mention a couple of things happening in this time period, we have the advent of the Hasidic movement, the Baal Shem Tov, we have the Reform movement, and we also have a man by the name of Rabbi Israel Lipkin of Salant, known as Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. And he was the founder of a different movement known as the Musar movement. And he also was bothered by a similar issue. He was feeling the lack of connection, the lack of enthusiasm the Jews were experiencing, and he took a different route. He felt by strengthening our moral commitment, getting back to the basics, the basic philosophies, the basic goals of the Torah, that itself would help strengthen our connection to the Torah. And that was part of his movement to strengthen the moral and ethical aspects of Judaism. The Musar movement was extremely successful in Europe, the Hasidic movement was extremely successful, and the Reform movement was extremely successful as well. All of these movements definitely caught on and had tremendous influence. The Zohar tells us, and I quote, "In the 6th century of the 6th millennium," meaning in the Jewish year 5600, "the gates of wisdom will open, and the wellsprings of knowledge will pour forth." 5600 is corresponding to the English secular date, 1840. What happened in 1840? The Industrial Revolution. It was a different world. For centuries, there wasn't that much of a difference in the world. 1840, once things started to really, cook, and you had electricity on its way, you had an entirely different world right about there. And there was a tremendous migration at this time. In the 1830s, there was a tremendous migration from Jews in Europe to America. Again, in 1881 through 1914, right before World War I, tremendous migration. Altogether, 2.5 million Jews migrated to America before World War I. World War I happens. That was devastating to Europe as a whole, as well to the Jewish people who were part of it. World War I, August 1st, 1914, Germany declares war on Russia. The date of that was the 9th of Av. And as we know that World War I was really the catalyst that went into World War II, World War II we're not going to have time to get into. There's nothing you could say about World War II, nothing you could say about the 6 million Jews who perished. But I will quote you, and I think I mentioned this quote perhaps in the first lecture, from Hitler, Amach Shemo. He said, "It is true, we are barbarians. It is an honorable title. I free humanity from the shackles of the soul, from the degrading suffering caused by the false vision called conscience and morality. The Jews have inflicted 2 wounds on mankind, circumcision on its body and conscience on its soul. These are Jewish inventions. The war for world domination will be fought entirely between us, the Germans, and the Jews. All else is facade and illusion." And I think what he was saying is the answer to our original question. Why is it that there is so much hatred? Because I think it comes from this idea. The Jews are the people who bring morality to the world. We don't like that. He took it to the extreme. What happened in 1945, the war is over, complete devastation. The Jewish people as a whole went from about 16 million to about 10 million people. And there are 3 years, from 1945 to 1948. Now we have, the Torah tells us, "And the Lord your God will return you from your captivity and have compassion upon you. He shall return you and gather you from among all the nations. And the Lord your God will bring you into the land that your forefathers inherited. You will acquire it, and God will make you even more numerous than your fathers." This is a prophecy we have in the Torah going back 2,000 years, telling us that although you will be in captivity, although you will experience torture, and the why, we have no clue why. But we do have a promise that that you will go back to your land. I want to show you footage here. This is from the movie, beautiful documentary. I recommend you all to take it home. It's very inspiring, very educational as well. The Long Way Home. It's the story of the Jews from 1945 to 1948. I'll play you one scene here to get a little bit of the feel of what happened. The light's over there, actually. This is the vote of the UN.
Afghanistan? No. Argentina? Argentina? Abstention? Australia? Yes.
France is a critical vote. The prospect of French abstention threatens to disrupt the entire West European front.
France? Yes. Good.
The outcome depends on the votes of a handful of tiny nations whose decision is in doubt until almost the last moment. In the end, many are influenced by the actions of the U.S.
United States? Yes. The resolution of the DUC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
With only 3 votes to spare, the United Nations authorizes the establishment of independent Arab and Jewish states in a petition to Palestine.
The vote on the 29th of November was greeted in Jerusalem by dancing in the streets, a general air of jubilation, a justified feeling that we've made a stupendous breakthrough in the long saga of the Jewish people across the stage of history.
We were happy that night, and we danced, and our hearts went out to every nation whose UN representative had voted in favor of the resolution. We danced, but we knew that ahead of us lay the battlefield.
The Arabs consider the UN decision unjust and inequitable. They argue that humanitarian relief for the Jews does not require dividing Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. Why should they alone have to pay the price for Hitler's crimes? They refused to recognize the proposed partition plan and began a campaign of violence against the Jews.
Grim climax of tragedy in the Holy Land. 2 truckloads of explosives blown up in the heart of Jerusalem's business section, killing almost 60 persons and wrecking some 1,000 buildings. The Arab High Command boasts of its responsibility for this act of frightfulness.
Although the UN plan calls for an independent Arab as well as Jewish state, the Arabs believe their military superiority can drive the Jews out of Palestine. Their attacks mount against Jewish settlements and civilians. The British government refuses to intervene. In Cyprus, in Germany, in Austria, the survivors continue to wait for the gates of Palestine to open. In the early months of 1948, the American government also turns against Jewish interest in Palestine.
Here was the position that the President of the United States was in. He believed in a certain policy regarding Israel. His State Department was opposed to it. His Defense Department was opposed to it. The rank and file of those in our diplomatic corps were opposed to it. The British, who had been the major power in that part of the world, were opposed to it. He had everybody against him. That did not affect him. He believed that they were entitled to a homeland, and he was going to do all in his power to see what could happen.
As the day for the final departure of the British nears, the State Department sends the American ambassador to Bevan in a last attempt to persuade him to prolong Britain's tenure. But Bevan has had enough of Palestine. As the dawn breaks on May 14, 1948, the last day of the British Mandate, Jewish, Arab, and American intentions are still uncertain. Zionist leaders are not only divided about whether to proclaim their new state, they haven't even agreed on a name for it. And if independence is proclaimed, will anyone recognize or acknowledge it? 50 hours before the still unnamed nation is declared, President Truman meets with Secretary of State George Marshall in the Oval Office. The President has asked Clark Clifford to make the case for recognition.
I may say so. I was really ready. I started at the beginning. And it was a very telling story. Gave a little history of the Jewish people, what they'd been through. I had 2 or 3 excellent quotes from the Old Testament, particularly from Deuteronomy, in which the Lord said to Moses, "These land shall belong to you and your people." I noticed Marshall's face getting redder and redder and redder. But I went right on as I had planned. When I finished, Marshall could hardly contain himself. He said, "Mr. President, he didn't quite point his finger to it, but he almost did." He leaned forward. He said, "Mr. President, let me tell you something. If you were to select the policy that Clifford has presented to you today, I would be unable to vote for you in the election this coming November." Total shock to everyone.
On the afternoon of May 14th, while the last British High Commissioner departs from Palestine, the executive cabinet of the Jewish Agency meets to make their final decision. By a vote of 6-4, they decide to declare statehood.
By virtue of the natural and historic right of the Jewish people, and of the resolution of the General Assembly of the United Nations, we hereby proclaim the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine to be called Israel.
news announced on the radio, I became for a short while speechless. Then I burst into tears. Mentally, I was transported to another location, to the death camp Auschwitz. In the severe frost, a group of young, barefoot girls proudly walked their last mile to the awaiting truck. As the truck started toward the gas chambers, they broke into loud singing of the Hatikva. At that time, I said to myself that beyond any shadow of doubt, this singing, like a passionate prayer, had reached heaven, and that someday it would be answered.
At 6 p.m. Washington time, the State of Israel is announced. At 6:11, Truman responds to their request, and the United States becomes the first country to recognize the new State of Israel. In the end, having argued his position, Marshall agrees to accept the president's decision rather than resign.
My own view is that Israel would not have survived without the support of the United States.
The years of exile and wandering are finally over. At last, the Jews have a homeland where they can begin to build new lives.
So we have their glimpse of what the feeling was like, what the mood was like, being able to go to Eretz Yisrael, to go to the land of Israel after all those years, after the experience of the Holocaust. It's something that I would have loved to experience myself. Can you imagine that feeling, listening to the radio for the vote of the UN, and then for the David Ben-Gurion. It was an amazing time, and the fact that the Jewish people returned to the land of Israel after 2,000 years, after being exiled twice, something that no other nation has ever done nor will ever do, that itself is miraculous. The fact, though, that it's said explicitly in the Torah 2,000 years earlier is even more miraculous. The indications here throughout our journey of history, of the destiny, there are too many amazing events, there are too many amazing situations that have happened to Jewish people to chalk it up all to coincidence. The prophecies in the Torah that we've seen unfold and come to fruition, and most recently in our generation, the idea of coming back to a homeland. I want to share with you a quick mathematical equation. The Talmud says that on the 6th day of creation, many things took place. That was the day that Adam and Eve were created. We're not going to get into what that means now. That'll be for the next series. But it says on the 6th day, on the 5th hour of the day, that's when man stood up. Now, the 5th hour of the day, the commentators explain, means the 5th hour from the beginning of sunrise. So it's really the 17th hour from the beginning of the day. The day starts in the evening, you have 12 hours, and then 5 hours from dawn, 17 hours. We have Kabbalistic sources that tell us every day is equal to 1,000 years. So that means that every hour corresponds to 41.666 years. What is the 17th hour, therefore, of the 6th day? 41.6 times 17 is 708. 708, the corresponding date in the English calendar, 5,708, is 1948. That, says the Talmud, is when man stood up. And that corresponds to 1948 in the secular calendar. David Ben-Gurion himself, although not a religious man, he said, a Jew who does not believe in miracles is not a realist. And that we've seen throughout history. To answer the question of Mark Twain, which we started off with in the beginning, how's it possible? The Jewish people, they've been around for so long. What's the secret to Jewish survival? So I think by now the answer is very clear. It's very simple. There's a verse that tells us, Eitz chayim hi l'machazikim ba. The Torah is the tree of life for those who grab onto it. If you're grabbing onto Torah, if you're grabbing onto the real, authentic, unadulterated Torah, that's a source of life. Mark Twain himself didn't get it. Many people didn't get it. Paul Johnson wasn't sure. But ultimately, we look back at history, we see what was it about the Jewish people that survived. So many different sects of the Jewish people no longer are here. Some very extreme and fanatic, and some just very different. What survived is real, authentic Torah Judaism. When we have, in 1948, the creation of the land, to bring it up to the modern day, we have as well, the day after, the first time in recorded human history, people twice exiled from land returned to establish a homeland, independent state. On May 14th of that year, the state of Israel was created. The following day, 5 Arab armies descended on the ragged band of Holocaust survivors who populated the new country, armed with only 17,000 rifles, 2,700 guns, 1,000 machine guns. Fewer than 45,000 Jews faced the combined military forces of Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Transjordan. That was 1948 War of Independence, and we smashed them. In 1966,